Sir, I've made it clear. We cannot have your pet here. Please leave immediately.
This is a federally protected service animal. What you're doing is against the law.
Restaurant manager, kicked out, disabled veteran. Then Navy SEALs at next table stood up. Former Army Captain David Chen maneuvered his wheelchair through the entrance of Coastal Prime Steakhouse at 1900 on Friday evening, his service dog Rex beside him as they approached the hostess stand. In 20 minutes, when manager Bradley Thompson decided a disabled veteran wasn't appropriate clientele, 4 Navy SEALs at table 12 would remind everyone what honor actually looked like. David, 32, appears to be exactly what ignorant restaurant management fears a disabled customer whose wheelchair and service dog might disturb other patrons' dining experience. But beneath his civilian clothes lies a decorated Special Forces officer whose injuries from saving an entire SEAL team in Afghanistan created disabilities that his heroism can't overcome. What happened in the upscale dining room would expose how civilian prejudice against disabilities could be answered by military brotherhood that never forgets those who sacrificed everything for others. Coastal Prime Steakhouse in Virginia Beach, an upscale establishment near Naval Air Station Oceana that caters to affluent civilians and military officers celebrating promotions, retirements, and special occasions. The restaurant prides itself on exclusive atmosphere and refined clientele, code words that often exclude customers who don't match management's narrow vision of appropriate appearances. The dining environment operates on image-conscious policies that prioritize aesthetic appeal over legal accommodation requirements, with staff trained to discourage customers whose disabilities might make other patrons uncomfortable. Recent corporate directives emphasize maximizing profit per table while maintaining ambiance that attracts high-spending customers who expect exclusive experiences. This setting represents the intersection where disability discrimination meets military sacrifice, creating situations where heroes face civilian prejudice from businesses that profit from the freedoms their injuries helped preserve. The restaurant's proximity to military installations makes such discrimination particularly offensive to service members who understand the cost of the disabilities they witness. David enlisted after 9/11, rising through special forces to command elite reconnaissance teams conducting classified operations across the Middle East. During his final deployment to Afghanistan in 2019, his team was providing overwatch for a SEAL extraction when they came under coordinated Taliban attack. David's tactical decision to expose his position while directing close air support saved 8 Navy SEALs, but cost him both legs and partial use of his left arm when an RPG destroyed his position. His actions earned the Medal of Honor and Purple Heart, but more importantly, they saved the lives of operators who returned home to their families. Medically retired with full disability benefits, David lives independently with his service dog Rex, a German Shepherd trained to assist with mobility and PTSD episodes that occasional gunfire or explosions can trigger. He's completing his MBA at Old Dominion University while advocating for disabled veterans through various organizations. His wheelchair represents adaptation rather than limitation, enabling continued service through different methods. David maintains contact with the SEAL team he saved, creating lasting bonds that transcend service branch rivalries when brothers in arms recognize sacrifice that preserved their lives and careers. Despite his disabilities, David retains complete tactical awareness and leadership capabilities that his injuries couldn't diminish. His service dog, Rex, provides both physical assistance and psychological support, trained to detect stress indicators and provide intervention during anxiety episodes. David's greatest strength is maintaining dignity despite civilian discrimination, while using his experiences to educate others about disability rights and veteran issues. His presence commands respect from military personnel who recognize his bearing and sacrifice, while his advocacy work helps other disabled veterans navigate civilian challenges that his own experiences have taught him to overcome with determination and strategic thinking. David must navigate civilian establishments where his disabilities trigger discrimination from staff who see only perceived inconvenience rather than heroic sacrifice, creating daily confrontations that test his commitment to peaceful integration, despite service-related injuries that saved others' lives. The primary obstacle is civilian ignorance about disability rights and military sacrifice, preventing David from receiving basic accommodation that federal law requires while facing prejudice from businesses that profit from freedoms his injuries helped preserve. The stakes involve both personal dignity and broader disability advocacy. David's treatment influences how other disabled veterans are perceived and accommodated, while civilian reactions determine whether military sacrifice receives appropriate respect from communities that benefit from such service. This conflict represents the challenge facing disabled veterans whose visible injuries make them targets for civilian discrimination, while their heroic service remains invisible to those whose freedom they preserved through personal cost that most people cannot understand or appreciate. David's decision to dine at Coastal Prime represented his ongoing effort to live normally, despite disabilities that civilian establishments often viewed as disruptions rather than accommodations required by federal law and basic human decency toward those who'd sacrificed for their freedom. Just dinner, like everyone else, David reminded himself while approaching the hostess stand, determined to enjoy the independence that his military service had been meant to protect for all Americans, including himself, despite the injuries that service had cost him. The restaurant outing was psychological victory over PTSD and physical limitations that could easily justify avoiding public spaces where discrimination might occur. But David's refusal to be confined by civilian prejudice represented continuing service to disabled veterans who needed examples of successful integration. Most people are decent when they understand. David hoped, while observing the busy restaurant that represented the American civilian life, he'd sacrificed his mobility to defend, trusting that education could overcome ignorance about disability accommodation and veteran sacrifice. His presence at upscale establishments challenged stereotypes about disabled capabilities while demonstrating that military injuries didn't diminish human worth or entitlement to the same services that all citizens should expect from businesses operating in free society. David's preparation for civilian dining included strategies for managing restaurant accessibility challenges while maintaining dignity, despite staff reactions that ranged from helpful accommodation to obvious discomfort with his disabilities and service dog. His approach emphasized education over confrontation, carrying documentation of Rex's service animal status and his own disability rights, while hoping that professional courtesy would prevent discrimination incidents requiring legal intervention. Most critically, David prepared psychological coping mechanisms for handling prejudice that could trigger PTSD episodes using breathing techniques and Rex's trained support to maintain emotional stability during confrontational situations that civilian ignorance might create. His restaurant selection considered accessibility features and staff reputation for disability accommodation, choosing establishments that corporate policies suggested might provide appropriate service for customers with mobility limitations requiring reasonable accommodation. David also prepared standard responses to common questions about his injuries and service dog balancing privacy rights, with educational opportunities that could improve civilian understanding of military sacrifice and disability accommodation requirements. His equipment positioning ensured Rex could provide both mobility assistance and psychological support while remaining unobtrusive to other diners who might not understand service animal protocols that federal law protected regardless of civilian comfort levels. David entered Coastal Prime during peak dinner hours, immediately noticing the 4 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms at table 12, whose military bearing was unmistakable despite their celebration of what appeared to be a promotion or commendation ceremony. The SEALs, Lieutenant Commander Harris Petty Officers Rodriguez, Kim, and Jackson, were enjoying shore leave while discussing upcoming deployments, unaware they were about to witness discrimination against the Army officer whose sacrifice had saved SEAL lives during their last joint operation in Afghanistan. Hostess Jennifer Walsh processed David's reservation request with professional courtesy that concealed obvious discomfort with his wheelchair and service dog, creating subtle tension that experienced discrimination. Victims recognized as potential problem requiring careful navigation. "Table for one, sir?" Walsh asked while scanning the dining room for seating that would minimize Rex's visibility to other customers, whose comfort management apparently prioritized over disability accommodation requirements that federal law mandated. David noticed the SEAL's recognition of his military bearing despite civilian clothes and obvious combat injuries, creating unspoken connection between service members who understood sacrifice that civilian establishments often failed to recognize or respect appropriately. Manager Bradley Thompson observed the interaction from his station while assessing David's appropriateness for upscale establishment that catered to clientele whose appearance matched traditional expectations about fine dining customers. Hostess Walsh's discomfort escalated when she claimed David's wheelchair might block emergency exits, despite obvious accessibility compliance that federal law required, revealing discriminatory assumptions disguised as safety concerns rather than accommodation refusal based on appearance prejudice. "We need to ensure all guests feel comfortable," Walsh stated, while implying David's disabilities created problems for other patrons rather than acknowledging legal obligations to provide equal service. The SEALs noticed management's inappropriate treatment while recognizing David's military bearing that suggested veteran status deserving respect rather than discrimination from civilian establishment benefiting from military protection of their business freedoms. Manager Thompson intervened when Walsh's stalling tactics failed to discourage David from seeking accommodation, approaching with authority that revealed institutional discrimination rather than individual prejudice affecting disabled customers. "Sir, our establishment maintains certain standards that require advance notice for special accommodation needs," Thompson announced while violating Americans with Disabilities Act requirements for immediate reasonable accommodation. His corporate language concealed disability discrimination that the SEALs recognized as illegal treatment of veteran whose sacrifice had earned better reception from civilian businesses operating in communities that military service protected from threats requiring ultimate sacrifice that David's injuries represented. Thompson's discrimination intensified when David politely requested standard wheelchair accessibility that restaurants must provide by law, triggering managers' decision to refuse service rather than accommodate disabilities that upscale image couldn't supposedly handle. "We're not equipped for your specific needs tonight," Thompson declared while violating federal civil rights law that prohibited disability-based service refusal. His institutional discrimination created exactly the confrontation that the four SEALs could no longer ignore as civilian prejudice targeted veteran whose combat injuries deserved community respect rather than restaurant discrimination from management whose freedom to operate businesses had been preserved through military sacrifice, including David's legs. The restaurant's discrimination attracted attention from other diners, who began recognizing inappropriate treatment, while Thompson's increasingly aggressive stance toward disabled veteran created atmosphere that experienced military personnel identified as requiring intervention. Corporate training that emphasized customer comfort over legal compliance created systematic discrimination, enabling Thompson's prejudice, while staff members recognized potential civil rights violation but lacked authority to challenge management decisions violating federal disability law. Other customers started recording interaction on phones, capturing Thompson's discriminatory statements, while documenting civil rights violations that would soon become viral evidence of restaurants' illegal treatment of disabled veteran whose service dog and wheelchair represented sacrifice rather than inconvenience. The SEALs' table conversation stopped as they focused entirely on Thompson's treatment of David, their military experience recognizing disabled veteran who deserved respect rather than discrimination from civilian management, whose authority came from businesses that military sacrifice had protected. Local news monitoring social media began detecting developing story about disability discrimination, while restaurants' corporate reputation faced potential damage from viral documentation of civil rights violations affecting decorated veteran whose injuries represented military service rather than customer problem. The convergence of illegal discrimination, military witnesses, and social media documentation created perfect storm that would transform Thompson's prejudice into national education about respecting disabled veterans and federal accommodation law. Facing systematic discrimination while maintaining dignity tested every lesson military training had taught David about representing disabled veterans with honor, despite civilian prejudice that challenged his right to equal treatment in establishments his service had helped protect. Thompson's illegal refusal forced David to balance individual rights against broader disability advocacy, using his experience as educational opportunity, while documenting violations that could protect other disabled veterans from similar discrimination. His response to civil rights violation revealed character developed through military service. He maintained composure despite personal attacks, applied strategic thinking to civilian discrimination, and prioritized mission success, advancing disability rights over personal satisfaction, confronting prejudice directly. The confrontation crystallized David's understanding of civilian-military divide. His sacrifice meant nothing to individuals who couldn't recognize disability accommodation as legal requirement rather than special favor that businesses could refuse based on image concerns. David's military identity strengthened under discrimination, reminding him that his worth came from service to principles larger than civilian approval, and that his response to prejudice would influence how future disabled veterans were treated by ignorant management. His service dog, Rex, provided both emotional support and tactical advantage, demonstrating trained capabilities that challenged civilian assumptions about service animals while validating federal accommodation requirements that Thompson's discrimination violated. As Thompson's discrimination escalated to complete service refusal despite federal law requirements, the situation approached crisis, where civilian prejudice would trigger military intervention from witnesses who understood both disability rights and veteran sacrifice. David's documentation of Thompson's statements created evidence for Americans with Disabilities Act violation, while his dignified response contrasted sharply with management's obvious prejudice and legal violations. The Four SEALs recognized escalating discrimination against disabled veterans while processing their growing certainty that David's military bearing and combat injuries deserved protection rather than persecution from civilian establishment. Thompson's continued violation of disability law despite obvious legal liability demonstrated complete ignorance about federal civil rights requirements while creating corporate exposure that viral documentation would amplify beyond local incident to national conversation. Restaurant security cameras recorded Thompson's discriminatory statements, while customer phone videos documented illegal service refusal, creating permanent evidence that would influence legal proceedings and corporate policy reforms. The convergence of disability discrimination, military witnesses, and social media attention created perfect conditions that would transform Thompson's prejudice into educational moment about respecting disabled veterans while complying with federal accommodation law that protected all citizens regardless of appearance. Manager Thompson's discrimination reached its peak when he publicly announced David's ejection from the restaurant for creating disruption with inappropriate accommodation demands, violating federal civil rights law, while humiliating decorated veteran in front of witnesses who understood both military service and legal requirements. "Sir, we cannot accommodate your wheelchair and animal in our dining establishment," Thompson declared loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear, while other customers recorded his obvious violation of Americans with Disabilities Act requirements that prohibited such discrimination. The situation exploded when David attempted final explanation. "Manager, I'm a disabled veteran with legal right to accommodation. My service dog is federally protected and wheelchair accessibility is required by law." His military bearing and specific legal knowledge caught the SEAL's attention, while Thompson dismissed both veteran status and federal law. Thompson's response revealed complete ignorance and callous disregard. "I don't care about your military service or what laws you think apply. This is private business, and we maintain standards that don't include wheelchairs and dogs disrupting our atmosphere." His dismissal of military sacrifice while violating federal civil rights law created exactly the confrontation that the Four SEALs could no longer witness without intervention, as civilian discrimination against disabled veteran triggered military protective instincts. David faced impossible choice: leave quietly and validate Thompson's discrimination or stand firm for disability rights, while potentially creating scene that could trigger PTSD episode from confrontational stress that Rex was trained to help manage. The crisis had escalated beyond individual discrimination to systematic violation of civil rights earned through military service that had cost David his legs while preserving freedoms that Thompson exercised to discriminate against those who'd sacrificed for his right to operate businesses in free society. Standing in Coastal Prime's dining room, facing illegal ejection while his service dog provided support, David confronted fundamental choice between accepting civilian discrimination or fighting back in ways that would influence how all disabled veterans were treated by ignorant business management. The safe choice was retreat, leave, quietly avoid confrontation, and report discrimination through proper legal channels, while hoping that individual education might eventually prevent similar incidents without creating public spectacle that could trigger anxiety episodes. But David realized that Thompson's public discrimination represented systematic problem affecting countless disabled veterans who faced similar treatment from businesses that saw disabilities as inconvenience rather than accommodation requirements that federal law mandated regardless of management preferences. If I leave without fighting, every disabled veteran will face the same discrimination, David thought, while Thompson prepared to have security remove him for requesting legal accommodation. But if I stand firm, maybe other veterans won't have to endure this humiliation. His decision crystallized around military values duty to protect other disabled veterans from discrimination honor that demanded accountability for civil rights violations and service that extended beyond personal comfort to institutional change that would benefit all disabled Americans. The ultimate stakes transcended individual accommodation to involve systematic reform. Whether disabled veterans would continue accepting civilian discrimination in silence, or whether federal disability law would finally protect military sacrifice from ignorant persecution by businesses that profited from freedoms such sacrifice had preserved. David's choice would determine whether Thompson's discrimination became learning experience or continued pattern affecting disabled veterans throughout civilian society that benefited from their sacrifice while refusing appropriate respect and legal accommodation. David made the choice that would transform Thompson's discrimination into educational opportunity, stand firm for disability rights, while maintaining dignity that would contrast sharply with management's obvious prejudice and federal law violations. Manager, your refusal to accommodate my disabilities violates the Americans with Disabilities Act and discriminates against combat-related injuries, David announced with military bearing that commanded attention, while Thompson realized his discrimination had targeted someone who understood legal rights. His transformation from patient customer to assertive advocate created immediate shift in restaurant dynamics as other patrons recognized illegal discrimination, while Thompson's staff began distancing themselves from obviously problematic management decisions. But David's assertion of rights created new tactical opportunity. The four SEALs at Table 12 had heard enough civilian discrimination against disabled veteran whose sacrifice they could identify through professional military experience. Sir, we need to have conversation about respecting disabled veterans, Lieutenant Commander Harris announced while his team stood in formation that immediately identified them as military personnel whose authority Thompson couldn't dismiss or ignore. David's courage in claiming his rights had attracted military support from witnesses who understood exactly what his combat injuries represented and why Thompson's discrimination was not just illegal, but unpatriotic treatment of American hero. The 4 Navy SEALs had reached their limit watching civilian discrimination against disabled veteran whose combat injuries they recognized as sacrifice that deserved respect rather than persecution from restaurant management that violated both federal law and basic human decency. Lieutenant Commander Harris coordinated his team's response with tactical precision that immediately established military authority. SEALs, time to educate this civilian about respecting wounded warriors. His quiet command activated military brotherhood that transcended service branch differences when disabled veterans faced discrimination. The SEALs' synchronized movement from celebration dinner to protective formation created immediate atmospheric change as their coordinated response demonstrated unit cohesion that civilian management couldn't understand or challenge effectively. "Manager, we need to discuss your treatment of this disabled veteran," Harris announced while approaching Thompson, who continued his illegal discrimination, unaware that his prejudice had attracted attention from witnesses whose authority and knowledge would expose his complete ignorance about federal law and military sacrifice. The restaurant fell silent as 4 elite warriors prepared to educate civilian management about disability rights, military sacrifice, and the meaning of combat injuries that represented heroism rather than inconvenience to upscale dining establishments. Thompson's confident discrimination was about to meet military reality that would transform his violation into education about respecting disabled veterans whose sacrifice enabled the freedoms he exercised to discriminate against them. The SEALs' approach created immediate tension as Thompson faced 4 men whose obvious military bearing and coordinated movement suggested authority and knowledge that his civilian management training couldn't comprehend or challenge through continued discrimination. "Gentlemen, this is private business matter that doesn't concern you," Thompson attempted while failing to recognize military authority that immediately identified combat veterans whose experience exceeded his understanding of sacrifice and federal disability law. Harris's response carried command authority that demanded attention. "Manager discriminating against disabled veterans concerns every service member. This officer's wheelchair represents combat injuries earned protecting American freedom, including your right to operate this business." Thompson's staff began recognizing seriousness of situation as 4 SEALs in formation provided testimony about military service while customers started recording what was obviously becoming educational moment about veteran treatment and disability rights. "I don't understand what military service has to do with restaurant policies," Thompson protested while his discrimination faced military witnesses who could articulate exactly why his behavior violated legal, moral, and ethical standards that decent businesses maintained. The restaurant atmosphere became electric as civilian ignorance prepared to meet military education about respect, sacrifice, and the meaning of disabilities earned through combat service that protected Thompson's freedom to discriminate against those who preserved it. Lieutenant Commander Harris began the SEALs' educational intervention with professional military bearing that immediately established credibility and authority that Thompson's civilian management status couldn't challenge through continued discrimination against disabled veteran. Manager, I'm Lieutenant Commander Harris, United States Navy SEALs. The veteran you're discriminating against is Captain David Chen, whose combat injuries were sustained while saving SEAL team members during operations in Afghanistan. His identification created immediate credibility while establishing context for Thompson's discrimination that transformed illegal business decision into unpatriotic disrespect for military sacrifice that decent Americans couldn't tolerate or support. Those disabilities didn't come from accident or genetics. Harris continued while educating Thompson about combat injuries that civilian ignorance couldn't understand. They came from military service that saved SEAL lives while protecting American freedoms that enable your business operation. Thompson's confident discrimination began wavering as military authority challenged his ignorance with facts about service and sacrifice that his civilian experience couldn't refute through continued violation of federal disability law. The SEAL's testimony created immediate complications for Thompson as his discrimination faced professional military witnesses whose combat experience provided authority that civilian management training couldn't challenge through continued civil rights violations. Petty Officer Rodriguez added personal context. Captain Chen's sacrifice enabled 8 SEALs to return home to their families. His wheelchair represents heroism that deserves accommodation, not discrimination, from businesses that benefit from his service. Thompson attempted damage control. I didn't know he was military. But Harris corrected his understanding. Military service doesn't excuse discrimination. Federal law requires disability accommodation, regardless of how those disabilities were acquired or your personal comfort with them. The SEAL's coordinated testimony demonstrated unit cohesion that civilian employees couldn't understand while creating educational environment where Thompson's ignorance faced systematic correction from qualified authorities whose experience exceeded his corporate training. Petty Officer Kim provided legal education. Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits exactly the discrimination you've displayed. Your violation of federal law while dishonoring combat injuries creates liability that corporate management won't appreciate. Thompson's discrimination collapsed under military testimony that exposed his ignorance while educating civilian observers about veteran issues and disability rights that protected service members from exactly the treatment he had provided illegally. The climactic revelation occurred when Petty Officer Jackson disclosed that David had personally saved their team during the Afghan operation where he sustained his injuries, creating direct personal connection that transformed Thompson's abstract discrimination into specific dishonor of heroic sacrifice. Captain Chen exposed himself to enemy fire to direct close air support that saved our entire SEAL team, Jackson announced, while providing testimony that proved David's disabilities resulted from protecting Navy personnel rather than personal misfortune deserving discrimination. Thompson's emotional response revealed impact of learning his discrimination had targeted genuine military hero. I had no idea, but Harris corrected his understanding. Military sacrifice creates legal and moral obligations for civilian accommodation regardless of your knowledge about individual service records. The revelation that David had literally sacrificed his mobility, protecting SEALs, created powerful emotional impact that transcended legal requirements to involve patriotic obligations that decent Americans maintained toward disabled veterans whose conditions resulted from saving other service members. Those 8 SEALs completed their mission and returned safely because of his sacrifice. Jackson continued while providing context that made Thompson's discrimination obviously unpatriotic and legally indefensible. David's response showed military humility, just doing my job, protecting the team. But the SEALs corrected his modesty. Sacrificing your legs to save SEAL lives exceeds duty requirements. Your disabilities deserve accommodation and respect, not discrimination from civilian businesses. Thompson's discrimination faced complete collapse as SEAL testimony established David's heroic service while creating educational moment that would influence civilian treatment of disabled veterans throughout the community and restaurant industry. Manager, you will immediately provide this veteran appropriate accommodation and written apology for illegal discrimination, Harris commanded while establishing consequences for civil rights violation that transcended business policy to involve federal disability law. Thompson's attempt at apology revealed genuine remorse. Captain Chen, I sincerely apologize. I didn't understand what your disabilities represented. His recognition of David's sacrifice created personal transformation from ignorant discrimination to respectful accommodation. The SEAL's education extended beyond individual correction to systematic reform of civilian attitudes toward military sacrifice and disability rights that protected wounded veterans from discriminatory treatment by ignorant business management. Combat disabilities represent American military reality that businesses must accommodate rather than discriminate against through corporate image concerns. Harris explained while providing broader context for respecting rather than ejecting disabled veterans. Corporate management arrived to investigate commotion, immediately recognizing their employees' discrimination had created federal liability, while 4 SEALs provided testimony about illegal treatment of disabled veteran whose sacrifice deserved corporate policy reform. Thompson's education about military sacrifice created immediate policy changes as corporate management implemented disability awareness training, while the SEALs' intervention established new standards for accommodating disabled veterans in civilian establishments. David received corporate apology and lifetime dining privileges, while Thompson faced disciplinary action and mandatory education about disability rights and military service that would prevent future discrimination. The incident's viral documentation created national conversation about veteran treatment, while the SEALs' intervention demonstrated military brotherhood that protected disabled veterans from civilian ignorance and illegal discrimination. Most importantly, Thompson's transformation from discriminatory ignorance to respectful accommodation showed how education could overcome prejudice when delivered by qualified authorities who understood military sacrifice and federal disability law. Thompson's discrimination and subsequent education by 4 Navy SEALs created immediate policy changes at Coastal Prime Corporation as management implemented mandatory disability awareness training while establishing protocols for serving disabled veterans with dignity and legal compliance. The viral video of SEAL intervention attracted national attention to disabled veteran treatment, while Thompson's transformation from ignorant discrimination to respectful accommodation demonstrated how education could overcome civilian prejudice about combat-related disabilities. David received corporate compensation and public recognition, while the SEALs intervention established precedent for military personnel protecting disabled veterans from civilian discrimination through education rather than confrontation. National disability advocacy organizations used the incident to create awareness campaigns about respecting military sacrifice, while restaurant chains throughout the country implemented policies specifically designed to serve rather than discriminate against disabled veterans with combat-related conditions. Thompson retained his position after completing extensive disability law training, while becoming advocate for veteran rights and inclusive customer service that recognized sacrifice rather than discriminating against physical differences. 2 years later, Thompson's education became catalyst for nationwide hospitality industry training programs about serving disabled veterans with dignity and respect that accommodated disabilities rather than prioritizing customer complaints over federal law compliance. The SEALs intervention influenced military-civilian relations as their professional education demonstrated how service members could protect disabled veterans while improving civilian understanding of combat-related disabilities and accommodation requirements. Restaurant associations nationwide adopted operation accommodation protocols specifically designed for serving disabled veterans, while Thompson's story became training material for hospitality managers who worked in communities with military populations. Disability advocacy organizations used the incident to create educational partnerships with hospitality businesses, teaching accommodation standards that respected rather than discriminated against disabled veterans while complying with federal civil rights law. The case established precedent for military intervention in civilian discrimination cases while demonstrating how unit cohesion extended to protecting disabled veterans from ignorant civilian treatment that violated both legal protections and moral obligations. David evolved from discrimination victim to respected advocate, whose dignity under attack inspired community support while demonstrating how disabled veterans could maintain honor despite civilian ignorance about combat-related conditions and federal accommodation requirements. His combat injuries became symbol of sacrifice rather than inconvenience, as the SEAL's testimony educated the community about disabilities that represented service rather than limitation requiring discrimination. My wheelchair tells a story of service, not inconvenience, David often explains to civilian audiences. Understanding that story helps businesses accommodate sacrifice and show appropriate respect for disabled veterans who continue serving despite their injuries. David's story proves that combat-related disabilities deserve civilian accommodation and respect, while Thompson's transformation demonstrates how education can overcome ignorance when delivered by qualified authorities who understand the true meaning of injuries earned through heroic military service protecting American freedoms. Epilogue. Today, Captain David Chen operates the Disabled Veterans Advocacy Center near Norfolk Naval Base, where his combat injuries serve as inspiration for newly wounded service members, while his story educates civilian businesses about accommodating disabled veterans with dignity and legal compliance. Manager Bradley Thompson became the center's first civilian partner, using his experience to train hospitality industry managers about recognizing and accommodating military-related disabilities rather than discriminating against customers whose conditions represent heroism. The restaurant table where David was nearly ejected now bears a plaque honoring military brotherhood that protects disabled veterans, while Coastal Prime Corporation's nationwide training program uses Thompson's transformation as proof that education can overcome ignorance when qualified military personnel take time to explain the true meaning of disabilities earned through combat service. Lieutenant Commander Harris and his SEAL team continue their service while knowing their intervention that day changed not just one manager's understanding, but an entire industry's approach to serving those who sacrifice mobility to protect American freedoms that civilians enjoy daily. Without understanding their true cost or the heroes who paid that price through combat injuries that became permanent reminders of service above self-deserving accommodation rather than discrimination from the establishments, their sacrifice was meant to preserve for all Americans regardless of physical condition or appearance.